So I'm hoping to do a video on all the different parts of biology in preparation for your biology exams in about 4 months' time. The idea of these videos is simply going to be that I'll go over content, I'll give you a couple of questions to do where you can pause the video, but it is entirely to supplement your own revision. This is essentially like having the lessons taught to you again. However, if there's something you don't get, it's your responsibility to come and find me and just ask me to clarify anything for you. Okay, so let's get started. So the start of B1 asks you to look at classification and how organisms are classified. So first of all, we need to define classification. So classification. Now classification is just simply the grouping of things by their features. So classification is just the grouping of things by their features. So grouping of things by their features. But instead of features, we could say their characteristics. So we could say features or characteristics. So does the organism have legs? That is a characteristic. Does the organism fly? That's a characteristic. Does it have feathers? That's a characteristic. So we need to know for EdExcel the way in which organisms are classified. So all living things on Earth are classified into groups. The main reason for this is so that we can identify organisms very, very quickly. Obviously, you know that a fish is a fish purely because it has no legs, it has scales, and it lives underwater. But that's because it's been classified as a fish due to those characteristics. Now, for EdExcel, you need to know how organisms are classified. So we can start with the largest groups, and the largest groups, the largest way that organisms are classified is into kingdoms. Okay, kingdoms. And the smallest group into which organisms are classified is into species. Species. So kingdoms have the most animals in, whereas a species is a single organism. So, as I said to you but we best get it written down, the kingdom is the largest group. This is your largest group, whereas the species is the smallest. Okay? And we have a range of groups, a range of ways in which organisms are classified from kingdoms to species. And for EdExcel, you're going to need to be able to recite this. So we start with kingdoms, we then move to the phylum, we then move from the phylum to the class. From the class, we move to the order. From the order, we move to the family. And from the family, we move to the genus. And then from the genus, we go to the species. So as we go down, these groups get smaller and smaller and smaller, and less organisms are found in them. Okay? But we need a way of memorizing this from kingdom to species. We need to know that you start with kingdoms, which are the biggest, then the phylum is the second biggest, class is the third, order is the fourth, family the fifth, genus the sixth, and species are the smallest groups. There's only ever one species. found in a group. There's only one organism that is a species. In a genus, there may be a handful, there may be 2 or 3. Whereas in a kingdom, you have got billions and billions and billions. Now, one way of memorizing this, and it's in a book that's right in front of me, it's one that I've never really used before, but you may find it useful, is to keep pond clean, or frogs get sick. So if you remember that keep ponds clean or frogs get sick, that tells you the order from the way organisms are classified. We've got the kingdoms, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, the species. I've heard various other ones that are being used. I mean, for example, I usually use knowledge plus careful observation frequently guarantees success. That's another one that you could use, okay? Now, something that I haven't really spoken about yet, but we do need to think about it, is that a kingdom is made up of organisms that have similar phylum, okay? So a kingdom is a group that has similar phylum. So, for example, chordata are a phylum of organisms that have a backbone. Okay, so all of the phylum chordata are found in the same kingdom. Okay, and likewise in the same class, in a phylum, they have a similar class. And in a class, they have a similar order. And in a family, they have a similar... in an order, they have a similar family. In a family, they have a similar genus. And in a genus, they have a similar species. So we're organizing organisms by their characteristics, the things they have or the things that they do. Okay? So, what I want to focus on to begin with is this idea of a kingdom. There are 5 kingdoms that you need to know about, and you need to be able to put organisms into the correct kingdom depending on their characteristics. So if we wipe the board and we don't save that, we turn it back to black because it's easier to see, like so, and return back to the pen. So there's 5 kingdoms of organisms. So 5 kingdoms of organisms. Okay. Now the 5 kingdoms of organisms are as follows. We've got Animalia, or animals. So Animalia. We've got Plantae. We've got the fungi. Sorry about my N. The fungi. We've got the Protoctista. I do apologise, I can't say that word very well. And we also have the prokaryotes. So prokaryotes. Okay. Now, some of these organisms have similar characteristics. Some of the organisms found in each of these kingdoms have some of the same characteristics, but there's always some differences between them that allow you to differentiate. There is going to be some more keywords, and again, I write keywords in green so that you can follow them, but obviously I'll define them as well. So first of all of the organisms found in Animalia, found in Plantae, and found in fungi are said to be multicellular. Okay? So Animalia are multicellular. cellular, and fungi are multicellular. Okay? Multicellular, as you've probably guessed or you can probably tell, is that, sorry I have to spell, multicellular simply means multi, many, cells. So it's an organism made up of lots of cells. Okay? So multicellular means made up of lots of cells. Okay? So multicellular organisms are made up of lots of cells. On the other hand, Protoctista and prokaryotes are said to be unicellular. Okay? Now, uni doesn't mean a big building that you go to get a degree. Uni means one. Think of unibrow. If someone has a unibrow, they have a single eyebrow. So, unicellular organisms are made up of one cell. Okay? So these are made up of one cell. Okay? Now, Animalia, their cells do not have a cell wall. So the Animalia cells, there is no cell wall. So you may be given a picture of a cell and asked to classify what kingdom you think it's found in. And if it doesn't have a cell wall, it could be that it is an animal. Okay? If it is multicellular and it has no cell wall, chances are that it is in the kingdom Animalia. Another thing that Animalia do not have is no chloroplasts. So they have no chloroplasts. Okay, so that is because we cannot carry out photosynthesis. We are in the kingdom Animalia. That is because our cells do not have chloroplasts. Okay. On the other hand, Plantae do have a cell wall. These do have a cell wall, and they also have chloroplasts. So these also have chloroplasts. Okay? So if you are given an organism that is multicellular, but you are told that their cells do not have a cell wall and they do not have chloroplasts, chances are that it's an animal. If you are given an organism that is multicellular and you are told that their cells do have a cell wall and they have chloroplasts, chances are it's a plant. Okay? There's two other things that we need to go over for Animalia and Plantae. So, Animalia feed in a special way. They are said to feed heterotrophically. They are heterotrophs. So, animals are heterotrophs, whereas plants are said to be autotrophs. Now, the best way to think of these words, so for example, heterotroph, troph simply means to eat. So if an organism eats another organism, it is a heterotroph. So hetero means different, troph means to eat. Think of heterosexual. If someone is heterosexual, they like someone of the opposite sex. They like someone of the different sex. So if you are heterotroph, you eat other animals. Okay? Whereas if you are autotroph, if you are an autotroph, you eat automatically. And the only organisms that do that are plants because they do photosynthesis. So heterotrophs eat other organisms, whereas autotrophs produce their own food. So they make their own food. Okay? So, Animalia, they are multicellular. Their cells have no cell wall. Their cells have no chloroplasts, and they are heterotrophs. Whereas Plantae are multicellular. They have a cell wall, they have chloroplasts, and they are autotrophs. So we can classify these organisms into different kingdoms purely by these characteristics. The fact that they have a cell wall, they have chloroplasts, and they are autotrophs makes them a plant. If they are an animal, they do not have a cell wall, they have no chloroplasts, and they are heterotroph. Now, one that's a bit in the middle is a fungi. Fungi are multicellular. They have cell walls. So these have a cell wall. They have no chlorophyll, so they're sort of in the middle. They have no cell wall like an animal, but they do have chloroplasts like a plant. So they have... Oh no, sorry, they do not have chloroplasts. Sorry, that's my fault. I'm getting a bit confused, a bit carried away. So they do not have no chloroplasts or no chlorophyll. Sorry about that. So they do not have chloroplasts. But what makes these different is that they feed in a very special way, known as saprophytically. Okay, they are saprophytes. So saprophytically feed. And what this means is that they essentially digest their food outside of their body. Okay? So they digest food outside of body. Okay? So if an organism is multicellular, it does have a cell wall like a plant, but it has no chloroplasts like an animal, and it saprophytically feeds, chances are it's a fungi. Okay? Now, the final two, protista and prokaryotes, are unicellular. So, for example, if you are given an organism and it's said to be unicellular, you know that it is either a protoctista or a prokaryote. And there's only one way to know the difference between these two, for GCSE anyway. So these are both unicellular, whereas protoctista have a nucleus in their cells. So these have a nucleus, whereas prokaryotes have no nucleus. Okay? So we've got the 5 kingdoms here. If you are given an organism, for example, if I say to you, I'm thinking of an organism, it is multicellular, so you know that it must either be Animalia, fungi or Plantae, because these two are unicellular. They do have a cell wall, so that means it can't be an animal. If it has a cell wall and it's multicellular, it must be a plant or a fungi. It has no chloroplasts, so it can't be a plant. Therefore, it must be a fungi. Okay? So, if we have a look at this. This is a worked example of a question. Okay? Something that people always come confused with is with viruses. Now, viruses cannot be classified into any of the 5 kingdoms purely because they do not have cells of their own. They have to use other cells to reproduce, and therefore they have no other life processes. Okay? So if you are given a question which is very common in your exam that asks why viruses are not classified in a kingdom, you need to say they're not classified because most scientists think that viruses are not living organisms. They're not living in their own right because they do not have their own cells and they show no other life processes. This sort of question would certainly gain full marks. So, what I would like you to do, I would like you to pause the video at this point, and I would like you to just quickly either discuss or write down on a piece of paper what you think the answer is to these two questions. Then we're going to go over it before moving on. Okay, so hopefully you did pause the video, okay? Hopefully you paused the video and you attempted these questions. So if we have a look at this first one, the question says, a paramecium is a microscopic pond organism. Identify which kingdom it belongs in and explain your answer, 2 marks. Now, this question has 2 parts, that's why it's for 2 marks. First of all, they want you to identify which kingdom it belongs to. Now, if we look at this, this is a unicellular organism. Therefore, it can only be classified either as a protoctista or as a prokaryote. Okay? Now, it also has a nucleus. Therefore, this should be a protoctista. Okay? Now, it asks you to explain your answer. So if you said protoctista, you got 1 mark. And your second mark comes from saying because it is unicellular with a nucleus. That is your second mark. Your next question says, the common frog and viper are grouped into the phylum Chordata. The viper and chameleon are grouped into the class Reptilia. Identify whether the frog or the chameleon shares more characteristics with the viper. Explain your answer. Again, it has 2 parts, the identify part down here and the explain part, which is here. So if you said that the chameleon shares more characteristics with the viper, you got 1 mark. So the chameleon would share more characteristics with the viper. Okay? This is because a class is a smaller group of organisms that are more similar to each other than the organisms grouped in the phylum. So organisms in a class are always far more related to each other than the organisms found in a phylum. Okay? So this takes us on quite nicely to our next bit. Again, for EdExcel, you need to be able to talk about the phylum Chordata. Okay? You need to be able to talk about the phylum Chordata. Now, Chordata are simply organisms with a backbone. Okay? So, Chordata are organisms with a backbone. Okay? Now, something that's quite important here is that you must say with a backbone. Backbone. Okay, you must say this backbone part. The reason being is most people say the spinal cord. Okay, if you say the spinal cord, it is wrong because the spinal cord is nervous tissue rather than your backbone. It's a nerve. We are talking about organisms with a backbone. So Chordata are organisms with a backbone. But we have all these organisms found within the phylum Chordata, and we need other ways of separating them. Obviously, we have lots of different organisms that are separated by other characteristics. So if you think about it, from the group Chordata, you could certainly have, so if I change my pen color, we have organisms such as fish, we have amphibians, So amphibians. We have reptiles. We have birds. And we have mammals, which we belong to. We have a backbone, therefore we are in the phylum Chordata, and we also belong to the group mammals. Okay? But we can't just say, oh, Chordata is enough to separate them, because obviously we're very different from a fish. Okay? We're very different from a pigeon. So we need other ways in which we can classify organisms. Okay? Now, some of the other ways in which we can group organisms is through the way that they absorb oxygen. So we can look at oxygen absorption. So oxygen absorption. Okay? So we could literally say that some organisms use gills, such as fish, whereas other organisms use lungs. So that would be one way in which we could separate mammals from fish. We could say that fish use gills and mammals use lungs. So we could literally say, although they're part of Chordata, we can separate them by the way they absorb oxygen into their body. Another one we can use is fertilization. Fertilization. Okay? Now, some organisms have fertilization in their body. So some have internal fertilization, whereas others have external fertilization. External fertilization. Okay? So, for example, fish, again, and some amphibians release sperm into the surrounding water, which then swims to the female's eggs, whereas mammals certainly have internal fertilization. We have to have sex in order for a fertilization to take place. Can I just point out here that fertilization, although you don't need to know it, is defined as when a sperm meets an egg. Fertilization is not just sex, okay? Fish don't really have sex, but they still do fertilization. So fertilization, if fertilization is defined as when a sperm meets an egg. Okay? Another way in which chordatas can be separated is by the way they actually reproduce. So we've got fertilization where the sperm meets the egg. Sometimes it happens inside, sometimes it happens outside of the organism. But we've also got ways in which they reproduce. So reproduction. Reproduction. Okay? Now, for example, we could have some viviparous organisms. So some viviparous organisms. And we can have what's known as oviparous organisms. Oviparous organisms. Now, viviparous, so viviparous literally means that they give birth to live young. So we are viviparous, okay? So these give birth to live young. If I can spell young, that'd be really helpful. Whereas oviparous organisms lay eggs. So oviparous means that they lay eggs. Lay eggs. Okay? Finally, that you need to know the ways in which we can classify chordata is by the way that they do thermoregulation. So thermoregulation. Okay? Now, thermoregulation, as the name probably suggests, is the way that they regulate or keep control of their heat. Thermo means heat, regulate means to manage, to keep, to control. Now, again, another key word, you have organisms that are said to be homeotherms and other organisms that are said to be poikilotherms. Poikilotherms. Okay? Now, homeotherms, anything in biology that says homo or homeo means to keep the same or generate themselves. So, homeotherms generate their heat internally. So, generate heat internally. So they do that themselves. Whereas the other one, poikilotherms, big word, makes you sound really clever if you know what it means. Poikilotherms are organisms that use the environment to manage their body temperature. So their body temperature fluctuates depending with the environment. So poikilotherms, their body temperature varies with the environment. So if we were to split organisms up by the way that they regulate their heat or through thermoregulation, we are homeotherms. Birds are homeotherms. We generate our own heat. Whereas poikilotherms, on the other hand, would be organisms like reptiles and amphibians. If amphibians are cold, they go and sit in the sun and they bask, they sunbathe to warm their body up. If they are too hot, they find shade or go into the water in order to ensure that they don't overheat. So these are the different ways that you need to know that chordata are separated. So just to summarize, chordata are organisms with a backbone. You must say backbone, okay, not spinal cord. They have a backbone, and these can be separated into fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. We need a different way in which we can separate these. We can do that through oxygen absorption. Some use gills, such as fish, whereas some use lungs, such as mammals. Fertilization, which is when a sperm meets an egg, can happen both internally and externally. Fertilization for mammals is internally, whereas for amphibians and fish it's usually external fertilization. The way in which organisms reproduce, so viviparous, for example, mammals, we give birth to live young. Okay, the baby comes out alive, whereas oviparous organisms, such as birds, lay eggs. Thermoregulation is the final thing you need to know about. Some organisms are homeotherms and some are poikilotherms. So homeotherms are organisms that generate their own heat internally, whereas poikilotherms are organisms that vary their body temperature depending on the environment, such as reptiles, amphibians. So. If we have a look at a worked example for a question that you could be asked with this sort of thing. The question reads, the bats and birds are both vertebrates with wings. but they are classified in different vertebrate groups. Use examples to explain why it is sometimes difficult to classify vertebrates. So, the person's answer, which is quite a good answer, says that bats and birds both have wings and can fly. So if you only looked at these characteristics, you would put them in the same vertebrate group. Both bats and birds absorb oxygen through their lungs, and they are homeothermic, because bats are mammals. But other characteristics show that they are very different and could be classified in different groups. Bats are mammals, as we just said, because they give birth to live young, whereas birds have feathers and lay hard-shelled eggs. This is called oviparous. Okay? Now, something that you must always be sure to mention, as is said in the yellow box here, organisms that live in similar ways often have similar characteristics as a result of adaptation to their environment. It can be easy to confuse these characteristics with those shared as a result of evolution. Okay? So, organisms have simply been chosen through natural selection to be more adapted to a certain area. Therefore, they tend to have these very similar characteristics. So, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video here. I'd like you to go have a go at these questions that are currently on the screen. You can either discuss them with a friend or you can write them down, and then in a moment we'll come back and we will mark them. Okay, so hopefully by now you've paused the video and you've had a go at these questions. So let's have a read of them first. Birds and reptiles belong to two different classes of vertebrates. They're both vertebrates, but they belong to different classes. Give two key characteristics that birds and reptiles share. So two things that they have in common. You could have first of all said that they both have a backbone. Okay, they are both chordata. They both do internal fertilization, so the sperm meets the egg internally. They both lay eggs, and they both absorb oxygen from the air through their lungs. Any two of those would have given you 2 marks, one would have given you 1 mark. Give one characteristic that is used to separate the reptile and the bird. So what could we use to separate them? Okay. We could have said any of the following. Birds have feathers, whereas reptiles do not. Birds are homeotherms, they regulate their temperature internally, but reptiles are poikilotherms, they rely on the environment to regulate their body temperature. Birds lay hard-shelled eggs, but reptiles lay leathery-shelled eggs. Okay? So, the eggs laid by reptiles are not hard, they're not like the eggs you use to cook with. The second question, which you can see here, has a target of C to A. Sharks and dolphins are marine predators that look similar. Sharks are classified as fish and dolphins as mammals. Explain why they are not classified in the same class, even though they look very similar. So, here you could have used a few different ideas, but the answer that I have here in front of me is that they look very similar because they have similar lifestyles, and they are both fast-swimming predators. So evolution has forced them to look very similar and has selected the adaptations that they have. However, sharks are fish because they have gills and are poikilotherms. Okay? So sharks have gills that you can see here, okay? And they are also poikilotherms. Dolphins, however, are mammals because they have lungs and give birth to live young. Okay? So, if you mentioned that they look the same in order to survive in a key area, you get 1 mark. Another mark for saying that sharks are fish because they have gills and are poikilotherms. And another mark for saying that dolphins are mammals because they give birth to live young and they are homeotherms. So, let's clean the board and move on to what I think are the final two sections. So we need to have a look at what a species actually is. You need to know how to define a species. Okay? So a species, if I can stop grabbing the pen, a species, and zoom out because it seems to have, seems to have gone a bit haywire. How do I? Okay. A species is defined as a group of organisms, that can reproduce to form fertile offspring. Okay? So we are looking at a group of organisms that can reproduce and have children that can then go on to reproduce and form children of their own. Okay? That is what is defined as a species. However, this has a couple of problems that are associated with it. Okay? So the problems are the fact that some organisms don't need a partner to reproduce. They are said to be able to reproduce asexually. Okay? So these organisms do not need to have sex. They do not need fertilization to take place. They do not need an egg for their sperm or a sperm for their egg. They simply divide into two. Therefore, if we do not see two organisms reproducing, if we do not see this group of organisms reproducing, how can it be a species? Think of bacteria. Bacteria don't need fertilization, but they certainly are a species in their own right. There's lots and millions of species of bacteria, in fact. The other problem is that we can have some organisms that reproduce to form hybrids. Okay? So, for example, you could have a liger, which is a cross between a lion and a tiger. But this liger cannot go on to have offspring of its own. So hybrids are organisms produced by two different species reproducing and are sterile, by which I mean they cannot have children of their own. Okay? So that's a problem with this definition of species. However, you can often be asked about what is a species. If it is 2 marks, you simply say a group of organisms that can reproduce to form fertile offspring. And the problems with this is that what do you do about organisms that reproduce asexually? That they don't need to be with another organism to reproduce. Does that not make them a species, such as bacteria? And how about hybrids? When you've got 2 organisms, 2 species that have got together, had a child, but that child is now infertile, such as a liger, cross between a lion and a tiger. Lions and tigers are species in their own right. They reproduce to form a hybrid known as a liger, but the liger is sterile. It cannot have children of its own, therefore it cannot be a species. Okay? So, something that we haven't really spoken about is the idea of scientists sharing new discoveries. And I do apologise because I thought that I'd placed a work question on here about it, but evidently I haven't. So, in terms of scientists sharing new discoveries, this is a bit of a side note. So a scientist may discover that they've found a new hybrid or they've found a new species and they want to share it with the world. So sharing discoveries. Sharing discoveries. There's a few different ways that scientists can do this. Okay? First of all, they can write what's known as a paper. They can write a scientific paper, kind of like a magazine, a journal, into which they can share their discovery with other scientists. Or they can go to a conference. A conference. Now, this is where scientists get together and discuss their new findings. Okay? But what's important about these is it gives other scientists, so these allow other scientists, to check their findings. Okay? So these allow other scientists to check their findings. They could repeat the experiment again, or they could look at the results from the experiment and say whether what they've found out is genuine or whether it was a lie. Okay? So, final page. Final part even. The final part is this idea of binomial classification. Binomial classification. And to be honest with you, in my experience, from what I've seen, everybody seems to struggle with this idea, whereas in fact it's actually quite straightforward. So, binomial classification. Binomial classification. Binomial classification is simply the way in which organisms are named depending on their genus and their species. So, the way organisms are named depending on their genus and their species. Okay? So if you think back to earlier, we said the way in which organisms are classified is knowledge plus careful observation frequently guarantees success. So we've got the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, and the species. Whenever an organism is named scientifically, it is based off their genus and off their species. Okay? So the first part of the name comes from the genus, and the second part of the name comes from the species. So, first part of binomial name is the genus, whereas the second part is the species. Okay? So, for example, if we want to look at the African lion, the African lion's binomial name is Panthera leo. So, Panthera leo. Okay? That should always be lowercase. I've done it as a capital. But what this tells us is that it is of the genus Panthera, so the genus Panthera, but it is from the species Leo. Okay? We are humans, and as our scientific name, as is Homo sapiens. The first part, Homo, represents our genus. We are in the genus Homo, and our species name is Sapiens. A gorilla, which is an unusual one because it's doubled up, but a gorilla is called gorilla. What that means is that they are of the genus gorilla and of the species gorilla. Okay? That allows us to tell what group, what genus and what species an organism is found. Now, the useful thing of this is that it allows us to talk about organisms regardless of language. Okay? So the binomial name, if I can spell binomial name, helps us by knowing exactly which species or which organism we're talking about. So, for example, if you go to Japan and you say Panthera leo, the scientists there, even though they may not speak English, will know that you are talking about the African lion. If you go and say Homo sapien, they know you're talking about humans. Okay? It also allows us to see which organisms are closely related. So, for example, we are said to be really, really closely related to apes, but as you can see, gorillas are in a totally different genus to us. Okay? Other organisms that our ancestors that would have lived thousands, if not millions of years ago, for example, Homo africanus, was of the same genus as us. They were very related to us, but they were of a different species. Their species name was Africanus, whereas ours is Sapiens. At the same time, cavemen were Homo neanderthals. That means that they were of the same genus as us, but they had very different species names. So, finally, before we finish and wind this up, we have a final question for you to attempt. This is talking about the characteristics of ducks and why it can be very difficult to classify species. Now, think about the binomial names given. Okay, what I would like you to do, as we've done previously, I would like you to pause the test, the video even, and then attempt these questions, please. Okay, so let's have a look at these questions. These are all D to A questions. So it says, look at the artwork of the hybrid duck above. So we've got the hybrid duck, and we've also got two other ducks, the pochard and the ferruginous duck. Okay? Suggest why, on first sight, this may be classified as a new species. Why might the hybrid duck be classed as a new species? Now, that's because, for one mark, you could have said they have lots of characteristics that are not exactly the same as either of these. So, for example, although it has a white tail flash from the ferruginous duck parent, it has a white tail flash, its eye colour is the same as the pochard. So you can't put them in the same species. They're not exactly the same. But If you were to classify on visible characteristics only, it would suggest it was a different species. If you were to look at this, you would literally say that this is not the same as either of these. Looking at them, they look totally different, so it must be a different species. But if that was the case, think of cats. Cats look very, very different. Think of dogs. If you think of a Chihuahua and a Rottweiler, they're both dogs, but they look very different. Okay? Something we'll look at in a later video, variation. So the next question says, so just to clarify, suggest why on first sight this may be classified as a new species. You should have said it has lots of characteristics that are very similar to both the pochard and the ferruginous. That's 1 mark. And then the second mark will come from saying that classifying on visible characteristics only would suggest it was a different species. So if we look, it looks totally different. Next question says, give 2 reasons why it's not classified as a separate species. So if it's a mixture of the two, its parents, one must have been a pochard and one must have been a ferruginous. Okay, so it was produced by the interbreeding of both these species. So the only other problem is that it's able to breed with individuals of either parent species or other hybrids to produce fertile offspring. So this hybrid duck can breed with the pochard ducks to produce fertile offspring. It can breed with the ferruginous duck to produce fertile offspring, or it can reproduce with other hybrid ducks to produce fertile offspring. So which species does it classify as? The final question says, explain why it is difficult to classify some duck species as separate species. Now, firstly, it's this big sentence at the bottom. It's because they can interbreed with other ducks. So, at what point do they become a different species? And also, there is a range of individuals with different characteristics between the species. So, there's lots of organisms, much like dogs, that have very different characteristics, but are actually classified as the same species. So, that concludes our first part of B1 for EdExcel. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll try and get another video done for you ASAP. Thank you.